Welcome to the Psychedelia Podcast, where we talk about the third wave of psychedelics. Through our many wide-ranging conversations with scientists, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and event organizers, we bring you an exclusive look into the many minds of the psychedelic world. It's time to let the word out about psychedelics and how they can be used as tools to benefit both the individual and the community. Welcome to the third wave.
Hello, listeners, and to the first-time listeners, my name is Paul. I'm the host of this Third Wave podcast. For all of you who have been with us, even for just one previous episode or all of these episodes, of course, I welcome you back as well to the Third Wave podcast, where we talk about how we can change the cultural conversation around psychedelic substances. So things will be business as usual for the podcast. We're going to start with This Week in Psychedelics, and then I'll get into the guests that we have on the show. It's a dear friend of mine, someone who I met a few months ago and who I just see eye to eye on with so many different things, some of which we spoke about in this podcast. So first of all, for This Week in Psychedelics, a few announcements. Number one, Oregon decriminalizes, I shouldn't say that, they defelonize. Oregon defelonizes cocaine, meth, heroin, and more. A new law reduces possession of illegal drugs to misdemeanors rather than felonies, as long as the person in possession does not have prior drug convictions. Although this isn't directly related to psychedelic use, obviously psychedelics like LSD and MDMA are included in this bill. This is an important step forward in the continued divide between state rights and federal rights that we're seeing in the federal government as dinosaur-era belief systems and principles continue to rise up with the Trump administration. I think the federal government will only continue to lose legitimacy in the eyes of its citizen and populace, and that will only lead to the strengthening of states' rights, which is only a good thing for what is going on with psychedelics and psychedelic research. After all, I'm a firm believer in the strength of decentralization, the strength of localities and communities, and I think probably the quickest path to legitimizing psychedelic substances is combining rigorous research with community-oriented policies that help people remain and become engaged in helping to spread the message about the responsible use of psychedelic substances. So I'm glad to see this bill being passed. However, I think it's just one small step in the eventual necessity of not only decriminalizing all drugs, but actually creating a legal and regulated market so that we can fully understand the effects that these substances have on us as individuals and communities, and we can actually make informed decisions about their use. Next little thing, New Hampshire decriminalized marijuana. This is also great, a nice little step. Obviously, we've already had 8 states in the United States legalize full marijuana. So this kind of seems like it's pretty cool and it's pretty nice. And it's definitely great in terms of, for example, most people who are arrested for cannabis possession are minorities. So that's great from a criminal justice perspective. At the same time, it will be exciting to see once, Massachusetts and Maine get their marijuana legalization bills up and going, how the rest of New England also follows suit, because it will be hard to avoid. So hoping for that on the horizon. In the meantime, New Hampshire decriminalized cannabis. Third little announcement. Jeff Sessions wants to revive DARE. Sessions' nostalgia for the Just Say No campaign glosses over the fact that it just didn't work. And again, this speaks to the fact that we have politicians in office who were elected by people who still live in the 1950s, who still hold some of these beliefs, some of these very dangerous beliefs that are clearly not effective and do not have any basis in rational thought and dialogue. These are old white patriarchal men who have no business in leading a country and who in fact are just accelerating the demise of a federal government that was already broken in the first place. So I don't see this as being funny necessarily, because I think it's dangerous, the amount of influence that some of these figures still have. At the same time, I think there's been enough progress in the drug policy world that the chances of ever reviving DARE are just about zero. And even beyond that, the fact that more and more families are sending their children to schools like Montessori and other kind of non-traditional schools. Our educational system is changing fast anyway, and the industrialized public school education that many of us were raised in is becoming increasingly not relevant. So, little piece of announcement from the Hit and Run blog on Reason.com. Jeff Sessions wants to revive DARE. Moving into the podcast guest for this week, it is my buddy, Dr. Ken Tupper, who is a drug education expert and co-director of the BC, that is British Columbia Centre on Substance Use. And Ken talks to us about his interest in ayahuasca and the potential of psychedelics to expand our cognitive capabilities. Ken discussed society's resistance to psychedelic knowledge and what we can do to revolutionize concepts of evidence-based medicine and objectivity. A couple notes on this podcast. We recorded it at Breaking Convention in London a couple weeks ago. It was hard to find a recording room, mostly because I didn't plan well ahead. And so we ended up recording this podcast in a hallway. So there are a couple cuts and a couple times when people kind of walked in on us and we had to stop. Also, Ken is a brilliant dude, but there were times in our conversations where we got caught up in a bit academic and theoretical talk, which was a little too abstract. So we try to work back our way into storytelling and more concrete things, but there are parts of this podcast that they get fairly abstract and get fairly into academic terminology. So if that's something that you think is going to be kind of a sleeper for you or might be boring, I just recommend that you fast forward through a couple of those parts because there are still some really pristine golden nuggets in this conversation that I think all of you will want to listen to. Last little thing, as always, please leave us a review on iTunes. I'd just like to add in that little reminder, the more reviews that you can leave us, the better. And also, if you feel called to support our podcast, we have a Patreon page in which we're trying to elicit community support from all of you who are podcast listeners for the page. And if nothing else, understand that media and podcasts, there are a lot of them. And if so, just making a small contribution makes you listen to this podcast more often so that you can become educated about what's going on with psychedelics, so that you can become more involved with what's going on in the psychedelic movement. If contributing or donating a little bit per month provides that initiative and that incentive for you to do so, then that's another reason why it might be a good donation to make. Nonetheless, it will help us with covering costs, especially as we're still basically bootstrapping and until we get some other things up and going, like our microdosing online course, which I will talk about in future podcasts. Also, as another announcement, I'm submitting an application to speak at South by Southwest about microdosing LSD for leadership, creativity, and general well-being. That is on the panel picker thing for South by Southwest. So South by Southwest is a tech festival, really the largest tech festival that happens in Austin, Texas every year for about a week in March. And I'm really looking to continue to amplify the message of the importance of psychedelics and rebuilding community and connection and transitioning our world from a zero-sum competitive model into a collaborative social entrepreneurial model. And I think continuing to do talks at very public events like this. I did one in Berlin last week at a tech conference. I did one in Amsterdam a couple months ago. I would really love to do it at South by Southwest as well. So we'll provide more details about that on the podcast in the near future. It would be great if you could support us in voting for the third wave and for myself and talking about microdosing. We'll also send out a couple emails to the email list about it. So that's it. Enjoy the show with Ken Tupper. Okay, so I'm here with my good friend Kenneth Tupper, and I'm really excited to do this interview. Ken, we've been, getting to know each other maybe for the past 9 months or so. We met at Horizons in New York, and then we spent a lot of time together in Rio Branco. So thank you for doing this, especially with this really awkward podcast setup that we have in the hallway at Breaking Convention.
That's okay, Paul. I'm happy to be here and glad to have the opportunity to chat with you again.
Now, for me, it was a bit of synchronicity when I ran into you at Horizons. I remember I had met Terry Krebs at Beyond Psychedelics, and she was at the after party or the before party speaking to you and introduced me. And I'd read a number of your academic papers before meeting you, and I was really inspired and influenced by what you had written. And that was particularly because I think we had been drawing on a lot of the same knowledge sources. Can you just talk a little bit about, who has influenced you and what has influenced your thoughts in terms of where you stand today?
Sure. I guess, my original interest in the idea of psychedelics or entheogens as cognitive tools for education or learning or creative enhancement or cognitive enhancement probably came first from Aldous Huxley's book Island, which I read as a teenager, where he described the fictional mushroom of moksha medicine that was used both for palliative purposes but also for educational purposes in this fictional land of Pala. And I think somehow that resonated with me. And I think it was the mid-90s, I read 2 books that talked about the idea of plant teachers in a way that I hadn't heard before. One was Terence McKenna's book, Food of the Gods, and the other was Wade Davis's book, One River, which talked about his mentor, Richard Evans Schultes, and adventures in the Amazon. And so in both of those books, I came across the concept of ayahuasca, which I hadn't heard of before, and the metaphor of plant teachers, the indigenous peoples talking about learning from the spirits of the plants. So from that early understanding of psychedelics in the way that Aldous Huxley had described them fictionally, and also knowing from the 1960s there was some research and obviously some popular understanding that there could be potential, mind expansion or cognitive enhancement from the use of drugs like LSD. And then hearing this idea of plant teachers made me think, there might be something here. I knew a little bit about the early research on the medical or therapeutic uses of psychedelics, and there was a bit of a renaissance starting up again. But I was very much more interested in the idea of Bob Jesse's described as being better than well, and the idea that we could potentially learn from our experiences with these kinds of things if they're used respectfully, judiciously as cognitive tools. And so I proposed to do a thesis in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, and was accepted into the program and proceeded to follow that topic for my master's thesis. And not only, this is in 1999, I was not sure that I would even get accepted into the program, but I managed to find a few professors who were sympathetic to what I was suggesting I wanted to pursue, and also managed to get a fellowship to go down to Brazil to drink ayahuasca with a Santa Daime, which I just told them this is what I wanted to do as sort of an ethnographic part of my research, and got the funding, $5,000 to do that trip. And obviously it changed my life, and subsequently led me to do my PhD on the topic of ayahuasca, entheogenic education and public policy, which was the title of my dissertation.
So just for our listeners, what is the Santo Daime, or who are the Santo Daime?
The Santa Daime Church is one of the major Brazilian ayahuasca churches. Mm-hmm. It's a blend of folk Catholicism, traditional indigenous culture, and Afro-Brazilian spiritualism that's incorporated ayahuasca, or daime, as they call it, daime tea, into their rituals that started in Acre, Brazil, founded by Mestre Ireneo, who was an Afro-Brazilian rubber tapper in the 1930s. In the 1970s, other younger people from urban parts of Brazil visited and started learning about these kinds of religious practices, brought them from the Brazilian Amazon to more urban centers, and also then by the 1990s, international people began to participate in these rituals and take the Santa Daime practices outside South America and incorporate them into communities that were burgeoning in the United States, Europe, Canada, Mexico, and now I believe like over 30 countries, or maybe 40 countries, I've lost count, of have points or chapters of the Santa Daime in their respective jurisdictions. And interestingly, creating headaches for liberal democratic states who are challenged by this intersection between upholding principles of criminal justice, public health, and human rights or religious freedom, where these kinds of practices are pulling in different directions with varying degrees of sort of ability to be balanced by the governments who are dealing with these issues.
And this is a topic that I want to get back to, because this is, a lot of our conversations revolve around this in terms of, nation states and things that go along with nation states, like the banking system, like even the educational system we have pointed towards industrialization. And I do want to get more into that, but I'd first like to hear a little bit about like your initial professional, experience with psychedelics. So we had been, speaking last night, for example, about how for you, there was a bit of a damned if I do, damned if I don't approach with, getting into this professionally. Can you talk a little bit more about, that process for you in terms of making that commitment and decision, even 17, 18 years ago, to really make this your professional track, the study of ayahuasca?
Sure. So, I was cautioned against following this topic for my master's thesis and then also for my PhD, but it was something, I was curious about. I was told I was committing career suicide, by other professors and colleagues who were less than enthusiastic about what I was proposing. But I felt, I'm here in graduate school, supposed to be about exploring questions about something one has a passion for. So I, fortunately, I think now didn't listen to those naysayers and really wanted to do this further with this intellectual curiosity that I had about these topics. And specifically what I wanted to do was ground the ideas of what I was talking about in terms of plant teachers and psychedelics as educational tools with some contemporary educational and psychological theory to validate at least the discursive space or discursive possibility for it. One of my professors at the time said, you have to imagine that you're working for your grandchildren here. This is not necessarily change that you're going to see in your lifetime. This is going to be a very long, slow trajectory, if at all, that it happens. I think actually I've seen a lot of change happen over the last, as you say, 17, 18 years. But I wanted to draw on the ideas of people like Howard Gardner, who developed multiple intelligence theory, which I found useful for a sort of heuristic frame for describing. He talked about existential intelligence. He described a number of different types of intelligence other than just sort of logical, linguistic, mathematical types of intelligence that are sort of validated in our IQ testing and school systems. I talked about musical intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, interpersonal intelligence. And after he originally came up with his ideas, people asked him about a spiritual intelligence. He was sort of uncommittal, looked into it, but said he wasn't thinking quite fit, but entertained the idea of an existential intelligence and published a little bit about why he thought it was not quite maybe going to fit his schema. I subsequently took his sort of criteria for what would constitute an intelligence by his theoretical framing and argued that if we think of entheogens or psychedelics as cognitive tools to help facilitate that kind of intelligence, just as an abacus can facilitate mathematical intelligence or a musical instrument can facilitate musical intelligence, psychedelics or entheogens used circumspectly, particularly in a kind of context like a ritual or ceremony where in traditional cultures they've been incorporated, they can facilitate this kind of existential intelligence and actually enhance our cognition and learning and open up a sort of dimension of understanding that traditionally our culture hasn't valued that much. Other cultures have very much valued, and so I thought that was a helpful way to think about, let's say, validating this in a discursive space that hadn't been explored. And then I subsequently published a paper on that. That was the section of my master's thesis and proposed it to the Canadian Journal of Education for publication and managed to get it published. And then I met the editor of that journal a couple of years later at a conference, and he told me it was the most controversial manuscript that they'd ever received. They had a big argument in the editorial board about whether it should be published or not. One of the reviewers called it morally abhorrent, the idea that drugs could be used for it. Like they thought drug education is about telling kids not to do drugs. And this was not about telling kids they should do drugs. It was really just to sort of, again, open up the idea that maybe there's something of value with this particular class of substances used in this particular kind of context in a sort of rite of passage, very much an intergenerational educational process where elders would be modeling responsible use, not a kind of free-for-all, take LSD to rock concert necessarily. Although, I don't want to say that's necessarily a bad thing to do, but much more risky, and that the sort of ceremonial context is a form of proto-harm reduction in which there's very great care taken in understanding that these are very powerful tools, not toys to be just sort of played with, but to be respected and treated accordingly as tools.
So let's talk a little bit about, psychedelics as cognitive tools. My particular interest is in microdosing. And for me, the approach I take to that is positive psychology approach, which is like flow states and inducing this ability to be really in the zone. Can you talk a little bit more about your understanding or approach in terms of what do you see as being the beneficial outcomes of using psychedelics as cognitive tools?
Sure. And also I'll talk a bit about cognitive tools. I draw explicitly on a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, who coined the term cognitive tools in some of his early work in the 1920s and 30s, which actually wasn't translated from Russian into English, at least until the 1960s and 70s. And he became sort of big in educational circles. He's part of the cultural historical school of psychology. And he talks about how our mind is mediated to some degree by the cultural or cognitive tools that we grow up with around us. And he used this as a primordial example of a cognitive tool as literacy, reading and writing, which is a very recent human invention. Humans speak languages. We have an instinct to learn spoken language, but the reading and writing interface, sort of cognition, is a very new and very difficult process, a very new technology and a very difficult process to learn in terms of, have to sit there and do rote memorization of the alphabet and learn to group letters or at least in alphabetic languages, learn phonetic spellings and that sort of thing. So he gave that as one example of cognitive tools. Others are mnemonic devices or maps or schemas, globes. Abacus is probably another good example of sort of almost a physical tool that can, again, and that what we've learned now is that these things actually can shape neural architecture, that we think of neural development as a sort of natural process through some of the developmental psychologists like Piaget. But I think Vygotsky would have said that your neural architecture is in part also shaped by the kinds of cognitive tools that you're inculcated as a young child in your particular cultural context. And there's been interesting work on oral cultures versus literate cultures. So cultures where people have no history of reading and writing and never sort of learned that until these colonial sort of impositions. And that the way minds are shaped because of that sort of absence of that particular kind of cognitive tool, the ways of thinking are quite different from the sort of natural, I'll put in quotation marks, ways of thinking that we find in cultures where literacy is part of the cultural context.
How are they different?
So I'll refer you to a book by Walter Ong called Literacy and Orality, or Orality and Literacy, which is just sort of forms of logical thinking and sort of syllogistic thinking, where you've got a sort of proposition sort of derived through those sort of basics of almost a Greek sort of logical philosophy that we associate with ancient Greeks, at least, don't really exist in the same kind of way, that the pure abstractions that are very easy for us in sort of literate societies don't kind of fit into the oral cultural mapping. And, the idea of history itself is predicated on written language, that history is a product of literacy, and that the sort of idea of what came before us in an oral culture, it comes through the spoken word and the narrative traditions that came through poetry. So the uses of metaphor, which again, we have in our language, but it's a sort of different kind of richness and resonance. And you see that in, for example, Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, which was understood to be an oral poem that eventually got encoded into written language by the ancient Greeks, but reflects some of those early sort of oral cultural traditions in the pre-literate Hellenistic era. So we're getting a little off.
We are getting a little abstract, and so I think this is something that I want to kind of tailor in a bit more in terms of like. I think something that struck me about your work is I really derived a lot of like understanding of my own experience with psychedelics in terms of when I did LSD when I was 19 and 20, it was a really profound personal development experience for me because I got this level of objectivity from that helped me to understand my place in the world and the utility of mystery and reverence and awe. If we could get it more concrete in terms of what's your understanding of the way that psychedelics can be used to engender these states of mystery? And what does that mean in terms of how our educational system and process will probably change in a post-industrial world?
Sure. So one of the things that's coming out of the most recent, both healthy human subject and therapeutic research on psychedelics is that they're, in the right context, able to catalyze experiences of mystical or spiritual type experiences that are often characterized by phenomena of wonder and awe, which I would argue in modern educational system, which is, public schooling, as we know, it's only been around for 150 years or so as part of the nation-state building enterprise of like Prussian government in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and then subsequently expanded into most liberal democratic states have public schooling as part of their nation-state building institution. But if you look at the school as a sort of structural force in society, it's almost systematically designed to suppress experiences of wonder and awe. The fact that kids come out of their schooling with any kind of sense of curiosity in the way that they had when they started. Kids start off at age 5 or 6 coming into school full of wonder and curiosity about the world. And by age 17 or 18, as I say, if they come out with any of that retained, it's often despite their schooling rather than because of it. So, it's interesting for us to reflect on whether there are mechanisms or tools that could be used as part of the, I would say later in the educational process, because I think there is probably a developmental stage at which it would be most appropriately introduced. Maybe discussion about exactly what age cutoff would be appropriate, but it depends partly on individuals. But something like experiential education in late teens, early 20s, experiential education programs like Outward Bound could potentially incorporate, for example, an entheogenic or psychedelic experience, perhaps an ayahuasca ceremony or peyote ceremony, or something that's equivalently going to allow for that catalyzation with these very powerful and ancient cognitive tools that would build upon the kinds of learnings that have already had taken place in, say, for example, a week out in the wilderness, sometimes spent in a bit of like a almost spirit quest where one's sort of in nature alone for a night or two, but then perhaps structured a ceremonial context for entheogenic experience would be a mechanism or vehicle. I wouldn't necessarily say it would be something to be integrated fully into the modern public schools as we know it, but perhaps an optional additional type program, just as Outward Bound is, for example.
And do you think, to kind of follow up on that question, we were talking about this last night, and I kind of mentioned this in my talk earlier, like it's about psychedelics, and it has been for both of us in terms of your work with ayahuasca, in terms of my work with microdosing. At the same time, it's part of a larger narrative, which is this changing world that we find ourselves in. We refer to this as being between stories in a way, right? So the old story was this idea of infinite growth and everything that came along with that. And now we seem to be understanding that that's failing, particularly because we are starting to understand that this earth can't grow forever. We can't continue to extract resources from it and expect that it will survive much longer. So we know we need to transition into a new story. What role do you think psychedelics can play, especially in the educational process, in helping us to transition into that new story?
Well, it remains to be seen, but I think there's definitely promise for the kinds of individual transformations in people's psychology about exactly those kinds of limits to growth and a sense of eco-awareness that is sometimes catalyzed by psychedelic or entheogenic experience. Certainly it's been reported in the academic literature that people have, first of all, a greater openness after the use of a psychedelic, and sometimes a sort of sense of connectedness to nature or interest in nature in a way that they hadn't previously. I think that actually was seen in the 1960s when these substances were being used much more uncontrolled, or the non-clinical uses that escaped onto the street were very much part of some of the human rights and civil rights movements, including like gay rights, women's rights, African American rights, of sort of black consciousness, black power movements, and also the ecological or environmental movements. Many of the leaders, not all by any sense, but many of the leaders of those young people were also sort of part of the psychedelic scene, whether they personally experienced them or not. But there was a bit of a kind of zeitgeist at the time of people changing their ways of thinking, and that was very much repressed by the prohibition that was put onto psychedelics in a way that very effectively kept them out of the hands of scientists and doctors, a little less effectively in keeping them off the street, but really did stop all of the scientific research on human subjects for about 30 to 40 years in any kind of major way, which we're now finally coming out of in terms of a renaissance in psychedelic research. And I think many people now who are paying attention to the new scientific research are realizing that we threw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of abandoning a really promising area of both clinical or therapeutic exploration, as well as, I would argue, also non-clinical or non-therapeutic potential that is equally, and this is where the microdosing work that you're pursuing is a fascinating angle that wasn't much done or talked about back in the 60s, but is certainly part of the new renaissance in a way that's getting attention from the tech crowd in Silicon Valley, as well as other people who are looking for alternatives to mainstream pharmaceutical approaches to treating things like depression or anxiety.
Well, it's this concept that you mentioned earlier that Bob Jesse has talked about, which is the betterment of well people.
Yeah.
And this aspect of this having this peak mystical experience, which was talked about in the 60s by a few people, this concept of self-actualization. In fact, Abraham Maslow, who came up with the paradigm for self-actualization, had done psychedelics himself and had talked about it in the context of that. So I think this aspect of the betterment of well people is one of those things that will become more understood and accepted once we transcend the disease model system that we have in like Western society. So like what I mean by that is people who are, for example, they have depression, they can be prescribed psilocybin, but if you're just a normal functioning human, you can't get psilocybin because it's not quote unquote legal. So this for me is a big part of the work that, I'm interested in doing. Is I'm definitely interested in these peak states, in just enjoying life to its full extent. And I think getting back into your work, psychedelics with this sense of mystery, reverence, and awe that inspires certain insights that catalyze changes on a global basis. So far, like we've talked about education, I'm going to try to get you to be very practical in a sec, or right now. From your perspective, when we look at education maybe in 10 or 15 years, what would you see as appropriate models in terms of integrating psychedelics into a society that uses them for the betterment of well people?
I mean, that's a good question. So I already talked a little bit about the sort of outward bound idea or experiential education model. It might also be for teacher education, and there was a great book called The Psychedelic Teacher by an author whose name is escaping me at the moment, but he made basically this in a book published in the early 70s, 71 or 72, talked about a psychedelic experience being something very valuable for teachers in training to sort of create a better openness or expanded openness themselves in their approach to learning and to sort of kindle experiences of wonder and awe in the teacher, who can then, of course, pass along without necessarily giving the drugs themselves to younger people, but have that sort of cognitive influence sort of rippling out from the teacher's experience into the classroom. That's one possibility. I think there's, again, through the scientific research and now using the new kinds of tools of fMRIs and MEG, like the real sort of advanced neuroscience tools, we have a much better possibility of learning exactly what's going on with respect to the psychedelic experience and how it's shifting neuroplasticity and neural architecture in a way that could be both therapeutic for individuals who are suffering from a host of illnesses that modern contemporary psychopharmacology is not doing a very good job of addressing. So anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, addictions, all of these seem to be avenues for exploration for psychedelic treatments as therapeutic tools. But in addition to that, there may be, as you say, this idea of that they can be cognitive enhancement, and for not just the people who are ill, but those who are, and the phrase better than well, I know Bob Jesse's used a number of times. I think at least I first encountered it from a book by a philosopher named Carl Elliott, wrote a book called Better Than Well, American Medicine Meets the American Dream, which is a fascinating sort of exploration of sort of self-identity and how medical tools can sometimes shape our own senses of identity. So yeah, I think that's a fascinating element, but I think there's also an important, especially with respect to ayahuasca and peyote and iboga, a recognition of traditional plant uses and the social justice issues that go along with the post-colonial realities that we face, especially in where I live, Canada, where there's deep injustices, both economic and social injustices that are still rippling. And I think the same in the United States and many other countries where colonialism still has deep impacts on individuals and populations that have in part been resisted by keeping alive these traditions and practices of medicine, which whether they incorporate psychedelic plants or entheogenic plants or not, certainly the sort of vitality that's been kept alive in traditional languages and cultural practices and spiritual practices has been really important. And it was certainly something that I was encouraged to do while I was pursuing both my master's and my PhD work. Because in both my committees, I had professors of Indigenous studies. Dr. Carolyn Kenny was a professor of Indigenous studies at Simon Fraser University when I was there. She was on my committee. She was very much saying, white boy goes and studies the Indians has been done before. You're not going to be doing that. And, had me reading up on, post-colonial literature and being aware of what was going on with respect to idealizing the noble savage and that sort of thing, and trying to resist the somewhat obvious temptation to go down that path. And then on my PhD committee, Dr. Tirso Gonzalez, who's an Aymara man from Peru, who was a professor at UBC, University of British Columbia, Okanagan, working on Indigenous studies there. And he also had the same kind of sort of cautionary notes and had me read up on the literature on sort of biopiracy and some of the issues around cultural appropriation that were playing out in the sort of globalization of ayahuasca as I was seeing it happen. So that somewhat sort of tempered my perspective on the enthusiasm, I guess, to some degree, that I think people who have had these kinds of experiences and want to share them with others, but to be aware that there are still sort of political circumstances that we have to be cognizant of and try to redress at the same time as advance the causes that we think may be helpful for both individuals and society.
So like being aware of the rules of the society in which we live, in a way, in terms of the illegality of psychedelics, is that what you mean? Or
No, I'm thinking more about, as I say, the social injustices that still play out on Indian reservations, and I use the word Indian in quotation marks because that's the official terminology in at least Canadian legislation. About First Nations is the term we use, and that they're not in museums. People and cultures are still very much alive, but suffering in many cases, worse than third world conditions in terms of access to healthcare, education, drinking water, that sort of stuff. So to talk about traditional Indigenous medicines and the value that they have needs to be balanced by a recognition that and this is something I've explored in some of my questioning around commodification of ayahuasca and its emergence out of the Amazon, partly as a material commodity for monetary exchange, which is a fascinating aspect of its globalization, but also troubling to the degree that, there's questions raised by it about economic justice and, who's benefiting when, literally hundreds of dollars or sometimes thousands of dollars are being charged for essentially traditional indigenous knowledge that in some ways could be characterized as intellectual property, an idea that I explored in one of my papers. So actually pulling back from that as a construct in terms of maybe its usefulness, but certainly hyper aware of the issues around money itself and the sort of global financial system and the history of like fractional reserve banking and how it plays out in exchange systems of value and reciprocity that we're all enmeshed in, by virtue of being part of the modern world, which is quite different from the cultural places from which these plants originally came, where those kinds of systems of reciprocity and obligation weren't about monetary exchange. They were more about gift economies. And how can we, again, learn from those other kinds of traditions and be questioning or skeptical of the taken for granted attitudes that we have about things like the pieces of paper and coins that we carry on in our pocket and just take for granted.
Cool. So what I want to get, just because I do want to talk a lot about you, or more about you particularly, let's talk a little bit about your, recent position that you stepped away from in terms of, we were talking about this at the World Ayahuasca Conference a little bit about how you had done specific work within the provincial government in British Columbia to start changing the way that people viewed psychedelic substances. Can you just talk a little bit about that, the work that you did for the provincial government and what some of your aims and objectives were in filling that role?
So when I was finished my master's thesis and I had applied for my PhD program, sort of in that period, I got involved with a group called Dance Safe, which was based out of the United States. Probably some of your listeners have heard of it, doing harm reduction at the time called rave parties, big electronic dance festivals. And we were giving out information cards about different drugs, so doing very low threshold drug education, neither condemning nor condoning drug use, but wanting people to make healthier choices in the context of active drug use, giving out condoms and earplugs and basic public health stuff, and doing pill testing when we could, doing simple marquee reagent testing to see whether or not we could find MDMA or not in pills that people were concerned about. And so through that involvement, I ended up running the Vancouver chapter for about a year and a half in the early 2000s and I had applied for my PhD at UBC, hadn't yet been accepted, but was doing this work and got invited to a group that was based out of downtown Vancouver of sort of local NGOs, non-governmental organization leaders who were basically promoting harm reduction in the context of Vancouver's open drug scene and the injection drug use connection to HIV, and wanting to open a supervised injection site, which eventually did open in 2003, but this was just a little bit before that. We were basically putting on public education events to educate local political leaders, community leaders about the benefits of this type of harm reduction intervention as it was done in Europe and had shown very clearly to be an evidence-based way to reduce risks of HIV transmission and prevent overdoses. So I got invited to this volunteer group that was doing this and participated for a while. And from somebody I met on that, I was offered a job to go and join the Ministry of Health in British Columbia to work in the Population Public Health Division doing harm reduction and prevention policy, which I took on in 2003 at the same time, or just after which I got accepted in the PhD program. So I ended up doing my PhD and working full-time in the Ministry of Health for the next 8 years until I finished my PhD, and then continued working with the ministry until I left in February of 2017 when I was offered a position at the new British Columbia Centre on Substance Use, which is a new health system partner that's got a mandate to provide clinical care guidance, health professional education, and scientific research in the area of substance use and addictions in British Columbia and Canada.
So let's get back into your time at you were in the health ministry, right, for the province of British Columbia?
For 14 years. Yeah.
For 14 years. What were some of the most important things that you worked on in context of your professional work with ayahuasca or psychedelics? Basically,
there was a very strict firewall between what I was doing academically and what I was doing professionally. And that was very clear. My boss knew what I was doing in terms of my academic pursuits. He'd known what I did my master's on, so there was no hidden agendas. And we worked out an agreement where I actually, as a public servant, wasn't able to do media interviews. It was purview of the minister to speak to the media about stuff related to my file. If I wanted to speak about climate change or transit policy, that would be fine because that wasn't my area of responsibility. But if I wanted to speak about drug policy, which was my area, I wasn't able to speak openly. So that's why I'm doing podcast interviews wasn't much of an option for me until quite recently. So I basically was pursuing my academic research. And actually, my original topic for my PhD wasn't to look at entheogenic education in ayahuasca originally. I did that for my master's thesis and left that behind, published a couple of papers, sort of left that behind. And for the first couple of years of my PhD, I was focused on drug education, school-based drug education from a harm reduction perspective. I'm still fascinated by that question of what do we teach kids about drugs in schools? We know that just say no doesn't work. We know that the evidence is very clear that things like the DARE program are ineffective. What do we do instead? I think this is a very interesting question that has yet to really be fully answered, especially in the North American context. I think there's some European models of drug education that are informed by sex education and sort of more progressive attitudes towards that. And I've actually written a paper on the history of sex education and drug education as they developed and evolved over the past 120 years or so in North American schools, which have some very fascinating parallels. I call them moral purity issues, two topics that just don't fit very well in the school curriculum, although there's a sort of political mandate and expectation, often by parents and community members, that schools should be the place to inculcate a sort of ethic of abstinence in many cases, where there's many other cultural forces that are sort of impinging on that sort of directive. And then just the feel for the teacher who has to be in the classroom talking about these topics that may make them personally uncomfortable based on their own personal experiences with both sex or drugs, and or just not feeling educated enough. They did your teacher training program on English or social sciences or history or mathematics, and now to be talking about sex and drugs in the classroom isn't quite there. They're in this sort of purview. But yeah, so for the first couple of years I was in drug education, but then actually because of some connections I made with some of the emerging ayahuasca drinking practices that were happening in Canada, I basically went back to the topic of ayahuasca and entheogenic education. Particularly, I was interested in how ayahuasca was emerging from the Amazon and, as it described, causing these conundrums. So for my dissertation, I ended up doing a policy analysis of Health Canada's decision on a case of the Santa Daime, a chapter in Montreal called Seo de Montreal, which had opened in the late 1990s. I think they founded the church there. And by 2001, had been advised, because of an interception of one of the shipments of their sacrament, that they weren't arrested. They were basically told, visited by the police, said, this shipment has been intercepted. You're advised to go to visit Health Canada to get what's called a Section 56 exemption, which is a special exemption that would allow for the authorization of importation and use of a controlled substance, which if you want to use it for research or scientific purposes, you'd have to get. But in this case, it was for religious purposes. So the church leader, Jessica Rochester, a friend of mine, wanting to follow the rules, engaged with Health Canada and explained to them who she was and what she wanted to do. And that started a process that I started getting interested in around 2005, 2006. And she had already been working on it for a number of years. So what I did for my dissertation research, or at least one part of it, was an access to information request through our freedom of information laws in Canada, and got 380 pages of internal documents on the file, emails, records, reports, etc., that were mostly unredacted. There's a bit of blacked out stuff, but enough for me to sort of unpack a narrative of some of the policy decision making that went on from the initial, what the hell is ayahuasca? When it was one of their first responses, to in 2006 sending a letter to the applicant, to Jessica Rochester, from the Director General of the Office of Controlled Substances, saying that they approved in principle giving this exemption, that they needed to work out import-export arrangements with the government of Brazil. And I actually also had the internal report that was sort of the risk analysis, where they clearly outlined the potential risks versus potential benefits and found that the benefits outweighed the risks, and thus they should make the recommendation. And the recommendation would be from the bureaucracy to the minister, who is able to, the minister is the one who authorizes the sign-off. This is our Canadian Westminster parliamentary system. So that was in 2006, just when we had an election that elected Stephen Harper, our former Prime Minister now, but for the next 10 years, he was a Prime Minister leading the Conservative Party of Canada, which is somewhat in the political sort of camp of Donald Trump type thinking, or the Republican Party in the United States, and essentially reignited a war on drugs in Canada, implementing things like mandatory minimum penalties and much more strict drug control laws. And so as that recommendation was put forward by the bureaucracy, the political wind shifted such that the Santa Daime is essentially left in limbo without the exemption that they were seeking for many years. And finally in 2012, there was a letter that came from the minister at the time, Leona Gluck, health minister, saying we deny this request. In fact, they didn't even use the term ayahuasca or daime tea. They just talked about a preparation of dimethyltryptamine in the letter back. And so essentially that closed the door for the legal access to ayahuasca for religious purposes by the Santa Daime. But then last year in late 2015, a year and a half ago, we had another election that elected our new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, a Liberal government, which allowed the church to reopen the application, this time in partnership with the União de Vegetal, which is another Brazilian-based church that had won in the United States Supreme Court a preliminary injunction to uphold their right to use their sacrament, the Vegetal tea. And so the UDV and Santo Daime worked together in Canada to open up a file to allow for both of them to get, and I'm happy to report just as of a couple of weeks ago, they received their exemptions. So the final chapter of my PhD dissertation can now be written, even though I had to finish it and defend in 2011 when it was still kind of in this limbo state, but there was a happy outcome in the end.
And I would imagine that's good news for you now, considering your current role in terms of the transition that you recently made, where you're working now for, remind me of the name.
The BC Centre on Substance Use.
And we know that, for example, ayahuasca is effective at treating addiction. And we're obviously also going through somewhat of an opioid crisis. Now, how do you see that transition playing out in terms of your current role, in terms of the potential of ayahuasca now to be used more in a clinical setting, potentially? Also with cannabis, what are your hopes in terms of, as the co-director of that institute, in your ability to use some of these plant substances to help treat major addiction or substance use problems?
Sure. So the BC Centre on Substance Use has made clear that we have an ambition to do a psychedelic research program. Right now, we're looking at the sort of more low-hanging fruit in terms of access to medications that have sort of most likelihood of getting ethics approval and importation approval from the federal government, from Health Canada, which is looking at MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. We're in discussion with MAPS about being one of the phase 3 clinical trial sites, and as well looking at psilocybin for the use of treating addictions, for alcohol use disorder, stimulant use disorder, perhaps opioid use disorder. We have not yet looked at ayahuasca, just because I had some sort of behind the scenes conversations with Health Canada, and the challenge for them is that it doesn't fit into the sort of pharmacological paradigm that they're used to. It's not a nice white powder that's measurable and replicable, and whereas MDMA and psilocybin are, they kind of get it, it does fit within that.
They're molecules rather than...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that we wouldn't be able to potentially request and access ayahuasca for scientific research purposes. I say that the Brazilian churches now have access to their sacraments, and there's a possibility we may be able to sort of work with them to figure out how to do some research. We haven't gone there yet. I mean, we're only a few months. We launched officially in April of 2017. And as you pointed out, our primary focus right now is dealing with the provincial and national opioid overdose crisis, where we've got a toxic drug supply with contamination of things like fentanyl, carfentanil, other fentanyl analogs being cut into the heroin supply, being pressed into fake pharma pills. So they look like oxycodone pills, but are in fact cut with fentanyl or carfentanil. So our biggest issue right now is actually, getting naloxone kits out, opening more supervised injection sites, getting opioid agonist treatment more accessible, but at the same time realizing that there are other modalities that we need to be exploring, and psychedelic research is one of them. Ayahuasca is not one of the first ones on our sort of to-do list, but it's certainly something I personally have an interest in seeing go forward. I was able to be part of a couple of studies with ayahuasca that were based in Canada. One was led by a colleague of mine, Dr. Gerald Thomas, where we had an invitation through Dr. Gabor Mate to work with a First Nations community on the west coast of Canada, who were inviting indigenous shaman practitioners, ayahuasqueros, to do ceremonies for treating addictions and stress. And we did a small observational study that we published the results of in the current journal, Current Drug Abuse Reviews, and have presented at a few psychedelic conferences. So people can probably find that easily enough. And then more recently, just had a paper accepted on a treatment, or exploring ayahuasca as a treatment for eating disorders. So this wasn't a clinical study where we were administering ayahuasca, but it was qualitative research led by a colleague of mine, Adele LaFrance, and Anya Loizaga Velder, who's based in Mexico. Adele is based in Laurentian University in Eastern Canada. We put together a small research project to interview mostly women. There's a few men who had a diagnosis of an eating disorder of some type and had experiences drinking ayahuasca, and sort of collected the narratives of the trajectory of their illness, their experiences with mainstream treatments for eating disorders, and then their experiences with ayahuasca. And very fascinating results that we presented at the Psychedelic Science 2017 conference and are about to be published in a journal. It was the first study that I know of that looks specifically at eating disorders with psychedelics, and hope that there may be a promising avenue for new treatment modalities for that very pernicious illness. I didn't know much about eating disorders other than sort of psychology 101 level, but reading these transcripts of the commonalities with some of the issues around addiction and trauma and sort of self-stigmatization and denial and deception that go along. It's really frightening. And then the sort of levels of morbidity and mortality that are associated with eating disorders. It's one of the most harmful physiologically of all mental illnesses in terms of early death, and sort of not much in the way of really good effective treatments at the moment. There's some things like CBD and family-oriented therapies that can help some people, and some people do naturally remit or have remission from these kinds of things. But what we found with our research on ayahuasca is that it can really help catalyze or help with that kind of introspection in the same way that we've seen in the literature around psilocybin, studies that have been going on at like NYU and Johns Hopkins.
So what were from an eating disorder perspective, what were some of those results? Like what were some of those stories that you found to be really touching or meaningful?
Just insight about where the roots of their eating disorder had come from, often reflecting, so this is, we're talking to people who've drunk between 1 and 30 times, and not necessarily right after they were drinking. So we recruited through the internet and word of mouth, and had people contact us and did interviews, sometimes long after they drunk ayahuasca or had drunk it a few times, and really about the insights that they had about the trajectory of their own illness, about why they had this disordered pattern of starvation in some cases, or overeating. I mean, there's different types of it. So we were looking both at anorexia nervosa, bulimia, and binge eating. Well, I'll just give you an example. From one of the quotations was a woman reporting that she had a vision of two sort of female figures, one on the left, a kind of skeletal, wraith-like figure that was sort of starving and decaying, and then the other on the right, a full-figured, beautiful goddess figure. And she said she knew which one she wanted to be. She chose the full-figured goddess. And just to hear, for me, it was reading like that sort of insight. It's so resonant of other reports that people have from their experiences with psychedelics, or ayahuasca in particular, where they have this kind of sense of insight about themselves and about tied in with their own ability to choose. They're not locked into a particular pattern of thinking or behavior that they may have been unconscious of in the past, and sort of getting out of ruts, as you described in your own talk today.
Yeah. And I think that then also ties into its benefits in like the areas of addiction, for example, is making then somewhat of a choice when people go through these experiences with ayahuasca or ibogaine or LSD, that they understand the self-harming effects and they want something better for themselves. And there's a lot that's at play there, but I saw you present that research in Rio Branco at the Ayahuasca World Conference, and I've had, not myself, but people I know have struggled with that quite a bit. So it was very touching for me to see that and hear that. And I think that's something that for me is really interesting about psychedelics, and why I'm so interested and passionate about it. I think also yourself is, we do have these stories of people, whether that's ourselves or friends or family that we know are either struggling with certain things and psychedelics have helped to address those things, or are struggling with things. And we know that if we had the education and awareness and the ability to contextualize it in an appropriate way, that could help to act as, a catalyst for their transformation into just living a better life. I think for me, that's a lot of what psychedelics come down to, is improving the lives of individuals, which helps to improve the lives of communities, which ideally helps to improve our global society and the values and principles that kind of underlie it.
Yeah, and that this is in some ways a new area of research, but not really. It was, a lot of research was done in the 1950s and early 1960s, and really positive results had been reported, although not with the sort of scientific rigor that we might expect today. And, there are challenges going on methodologically in the scientific community at the time about the randomized control trial, double-blind, being imposed to some degree as a sort of gold standard for determining efficacy of a treatment, in a way that was sort of predicated on studies on antibiotics, and that drug in results in output X, which is not the way that psychedelics work, right? And there were researchers on psychedelics, particularly Humphrey Osmond and Duncan Blewett and Abram Hoffer, who were in Saskatchewan, Canada, who were very much resistant to this. They're arguing that psychedelics are a tool to enhance psychotherapy, and we can't expect that what they saw some of their colleagues try to do was just give the drug without any of the set and setting taken care of, and reported not very good clinical results. It's like, they were sort of annoyed that this wasn't being respected in the way that they developed very carefully protocols that were able to maximize the mystical or spiritual type experience that we now know from the latest research is often correlated with the positive health outcomes, right? So fortunately, the new research that's taking place now is very much cognizant of drawing on that understanding of these are psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy techniques that can be also studied with their RCT design, and that we can use rigorous scientific methodologies, but also incorporate those understandings of how these need to be carefully used and contextualized. And, there's, I think of, Bill Wilson from the 12-step movement, one of the founders of AA, who talked about the value of LSD for himself in the 1950s and how it would be a very good complement to the sort of 12-step community, and having a spiritual type experience. One of the steps in the 12-step movement could be potentially catalyzed through psychedelics, and there's no necessary antagonism between a recovery-oriented model of treatment and the use of a psychedelic as part of that. So hopefully we'll see more of that. And I know there's some work going on. There's a guy named Todd Young who's working on ayahuasca and the AA movement in Washington State, doing some really interesting research on that, and others who are sort of opening their minds to the possibility of integrating much more traditional conservative approaches to addictions and psychedelics.
I think that's why it was so important with the research that came out of Johns Hopkins in 2006 that Roland Griffiths did, which was basically laying the groundwork and the framework for explaining why psychedelics are so effective at treating so many different issues. And the research was, how psychedelics can basically engender a peak mystical experience. And it seems to be at the core of a lot of this healing, seems to be this mystical experience that people have. I put up that slide in my last microdosing talk where I gave that quote from George Greer, who's the medical director at Hafter Research Institute, which was basically like, look, we need to step outside. Well, he didn't say this, but I'm kind of paraphrasing and building on what you mentioned yesterday, which is the limits of quantitative data. It might not just be biological effects. There might be something going on psychospiritually where it's having this really impactful, transformative effect, which I think then gets into what we're talking about in terms of a transition in between stories. The story in the past has been disconnection. It's been individualism. It's been isolation. Especially in the 20th century, it's been insecurity for consumerism, materialism. And now we seem to be entering this new story where we're looking at things more from like a holistic perspective. We're looking at the community. We're looking at the connection. We're looking at ways to facilitate that. This kind of ties into what you were talking about when we move away from white powders. Right now, we're still stuck in that paradigm of measurable quantities, even though we know that when ayahuasca is used within, a specific context, that it has the outcome or effect that we want. However, because it can't be quantified to the same degree as like MDMA, it hasn't been as widely accepted within, scientific institutions.
Yeah, it's emblematic of a classical paradigm shift, to use Thomas Kuhn's phrase. What we saw in early modern science is some ideas that I explored in a paper with Bia Labate on sort of history and philosophy of science. But in early modern science, in the 15th, 16th century, the epistemic authorities of the day were church fathers who understood knowledge to come from texts such as the Bible or Aristotle. And the university system at the time was bound up with that way of thinking, medieval scholasticism. And beginnings of early modern science, and the word science or the word scientist didn't exist yet. People who were doing this were called natural philosophers. They were very much, for the most part, outside of that epistemic authoritative structure. They weren't within the universities. They weren't medieval scholastics. They were amateur intellectuals, in many cases, drawing on new ideas that were being disseminated by virtue of the printing press, sort of outside of the mainstream authoritative epistemic structures, and deploying new kinds of tools that extended the limits of human perception. So at the time, those were things like telescopes, microscopes, clocks, theodolites. And those tools were very much revolutionary to the degree that they were threatening for those epistemic authorities. So there's great quotes of church fathers who refused to look through the telescope, persecuted Galileo for suggesting that there was moons going around Jupiter. So, there was a resistance to deploying these newfangled kinds of tools. And if you fast forward 300 or 400 years to today, we have a similar kind of epistemic authoritative structure, but today it's actually scientists themselves, where over the past 300 years, especially in the 19th century, science became professionalized and integrated into the university system and very much, embedded within the nation state and corporate structures that has now sort of in some ways replicated that sort of conservatism that was reflected 400 years ago. And we've lost touch with the revolutionary origins of curiosity and experimentation that started off early modern science. So along come these new, actually not new, very ancient kinds of cognitive tools that extend the limits of human perception. Things like ayahuasca, peyote, LSD, psilocybin, that are very much challenging some of the mainstream epistemic authorities of today who say, just like church fathers, I don't need to look through this newfangled thing. I know what I need to know from my rigorous methodology that's gotten me, all my grants and tenures and things. But what we're seeing perhaps is that these are revolutionary kinds of cognitive tools that can actually engender a new way of thinking for those who are willing to look through the telescope. And it led us to question the idea of self-experimentation and to what degree firsthand experience is necessary. And one of the examples I like to use is if you're a research lab well-funded to administer, for example, ayahuasca or a psychedelic day after day after day, do it for 20 years, and research subjects come in, fMRI scans, all kinds of great measurements, cranking out publications regularly, but you as the team leader in the lab never drink ayahuasca. At the end of 20 years, what do you know about ayahuasca? It's for me, a fascinating epistemological question that very much illustrates that we're in a bit of a paradigm shift where it's hard for us to make authoritative statements without being able to participate in this interdiscursivity, this discursive community that's emerging from those who have had these kinds of experiences. And generally when they do, not universally, but generally people who do are reporting being fascinated by it and seeing potential benefits that we want to try to advance, both through Western science, but also by taking seriously the traditional indigenous knowledge claims of things like plant teachers, which is, with the ayahuasca experience, often very much part of feeling like you're in touch with a sentient being, that it's, that there's something greater than what you thought was, the total sum of reality.
Picking up on that last thought, then what do you see as the key to unlocking the ability to have this discourse more openly? So a big issue that we see, or that some people perceive in the psychedelic space right now, is something that you touched on in your talk, which, well, I guess you didn't really talk on it, but this is a discourse. It's like psychedelic scientists, the leaders, Roland Griffiths, Robin Carhart Harris, Stephen Ross, Michael
Bogenschutz.
Yep, NYU. A lot of them can't openly talk about possibly their own psychedelic experiences because of fear of the stigma and cultural backlash. In essence, they fear that if they do talk about it openly, it makes them less objective in nature, which then doesn't fit as well into the paradigm that we currently operate in. How do you perceive that paradigm shift occurring? Do you think that happens with the introduction of the medicalization of psychedelics? Do you think it's, the ending of the drug war and the removal of the fact that these are Schedule I substances? And those aren't necessarily related, though they certainly can be. One of my big things is, I look at not only obviously the medicalization of psychedelics, but the full legalization and reintegration. And, one of my hypotheses is that we probably won't get there until we've accepted that all drugs, including some that are more harmful, coke, heroin, whatever else, GHB, that we regulate and control all of them. So what do you see as being the key to unlocking the ability to have more of that, discourse?
So I think one of the key ones you mentioned is stigma, that there's generally a stigma within society itself, but particularly within the academic circles, where the sense of objectivity is seen to be compromised by either having or revealing one's own personal experience. And that idea of objectivity is actually a relatively recent idea in sort of scientific communities. It's not part of the early modern science approach. Didn't always, in fact, for many scientists, self-experimentation was considered a crucial part of what they were doing. It was only late 19th century that this idea of objectivity got more imposed in a way that sort of still resonates for most scientists today, who have this kind of fear of being called out as unobjective or subjective in their reporting of scientific data. So I think that's one piece of it. I think the power of the internet and the sharing of stories by people who've had personal experience is very quickly sort of shifting that in a way that's making it difficult to deny the potential benefits that are reported by, not universally, not everybody, but many, many people who have these experiences talk about both personal and sort of social transformations that they've witnessed from it and the potential that they see for it. And with regards to drug policy, absolutely, the failures of prohibition are becoming so clearly apparent. Again, in British Columbia, particularly with the opioid overdose crisis, where there's a lot of discussion right now, even among political leaders, about the need to move to systems of control of currently illegal drugs that involve the entire supply chain from production through distribution in a way that doesn't resort to the blunt instrument of criminal law, which is what we've been doing for 100 years. And on pretty much every measure failed. Drugs are cheaper, more easily available, more harmful than ever before. And this is after, 100 years of a war on drugs, and particularly the last 40 years, and most egregiously fought in the United States with probably the least effective results other than a burgeoning prison population and undermining social institutions and that sort of thing. So colleagues and I have written a paper on the post-prohibition model for the regulation of psychedelics based on public health principles. So that was my colleague Mark Hayden and Dr. Brian Emerson, who is with me at the Ministry of Health. And we discuss in that paper ways to envision regulatory models for psychedelics, both for medical and non-medical purposes. So I urge you and your listeners to go and check that out. I've got it on my website.
Well, what would be some details about that? Like, what would be kind of the key points?
Well, recognizing first that to affront the libertarians in the audience, that perhaps some system of control is going to be helpful here, that a complete, the model of selling at 7-Eleven to any 10-year-old who walks in with $5 to get a hit of acid, probably not where we want it. It is one possible model, right? The full Coca-Cola model of free market capitalism. It's a possible way to deal with it. We argue that that's probably not the best way. But what we argue for is let's take a look at some of the regulatory tools that have been very effective in dealing with some harmful substances such as alcohol, tobacco, and now in Canada, cannabis, because we're moving towards legalization of cannabis by next year, and realizing that, okay, let's look carefully at the potential benefits and harms, what we know from the scientific literature on psychedelics about both medical and non-medical uses and access, and how do we create. One of the things we talk about is, for example, a college of psychedelic supervisors, so a sort of self-regulatory structure similar to we have colleges of physicians or colleges of nurses, where people who want to be certified and have oversight over ethical behaviors among colleagues. So we separate out people who might want to do this professionally and charge fees for the services versus people who might want to do it more as a public benefit for small groups of friends but not get the sort of full credentials. So I won't go through the long, boring details but I think it's an interesting, and we are the first to say, this is not the model that we want to impose this necessarily on the world, but we need to have the discussion. It's all well and good to say, prohibition's a failure, but now we need to start talking about, okay, what is the architecture of the post-prohibition world going to look like? And, other people have been engaged in this discussion. Steve Rolls with Transform here in the UK has done that kind of work. Ethan Nadelman's been talking about it with the Drug Policy Alliance, of course, and others. So we're just sort of contributing to that conversation, but with particular focus on psychedelics.
I think, Rick from MAPS has also spoken at length about that. In fact, he's been pretty open about the fact that he wants to kind of walk MDMA through in a professional suit to become medicalized with the hope of unlocking that door, similar to what we saw with medical cannabis.
So, the pathway to medicalization is very clear. But in our paper, we actually talk about medical and non-medical.
Sure.
Like we want to be not restricting it to just medical access. Because, there is this sort of fairly, I think, short-term, by continuing with the scientific research, moving to phase 3 clinical trials, and then expanded access after that. But what about all the rest of us who are perhaps want to be better than well, aren't necessarily, diagnosed with an indication that would allow you to have access for medical purposes.
Cool. Well, I think let's wrap it up there. Thanks again for doing this. And, we'll have plenty more great conversations. If, our listeners want to find you, what would be a good, your URL or the substance use website, anything like that?
So the institution I work for, if people are interested, the British Columbia Centre on Substance Use, which is www.bccsu.ca. And then I have a personal homepage, which is www.kentupper.com.
Perfect. Thanks, Ken.
All right. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Psychedelia Podcast with Paul Austin. Want more psychedelic information? Go to our website at thethirdwave.co and register for our email list and newsletter. Also, please consider donating to The Third Wave via our Patreon page. Donations make this podcast possible. Psychedelics have the potential to transform lives. By donating, you enable us to continue to inform people about the benefits of these powerful substances.